Today we're looking at the heart, and the first thing that we want to look at is how the heart beats, how we get blood through the body. And to understand this, we have to understand that there's two different types of cells in the heart that will send action potentials. The first one is an autoarrhythmic cell, and the second one is the cardiomyocytes, the heart muscle cells. So to look at this, we're going to look at the action potential graphs of both. We'll first look at the autoarrhythmic cells, or the cells that set the rate, the heartbeat, and then we'll look at cardiomyocytes. So if we have a graph here for our action potential graph for our cardiomyocytes, right here at about -60, this is where the autoarrhythmic cells sit. That's their kind of baseline, but their graph looks a little different. So we have threshold right here, and we have, instead of maintaining a solid resting membrane potential and then receiving potentials or action potentials, things to start an action potential, it actually has different types of channels that continuously open and close to set the rhythm of the heart. So instead of a flat line here, we'll have a line with a slope, and then it'll do an action potential and it'll come back down. And once it hits about -60 again, it'll turn, go up, and then another action potential. So it's kind of like that all the way through. And the reason this works is down here, we have HCN channels, or hyperpolarization cyclic nucleotide channels. These are channels that allow sodium into the cell. So these are sodium channels. They allow sodium into the cell, creating a depolarization. And once we hit threshold, we have our ICA channels. We have a couple different calcium channels that open. We have a long one and a short one. So they open, and that allows calcium into the cell, making it depolarize much faster. And as that depolarizes, they begin to close, and we have another channel over here for potassium. So up here at this point, when we've hit the max amount of positive charges in, it'll close these calcium channels and open these potassium channels, triggering a hyperpolarization or repolarization to a hyperpolarization. It'll do a repolarization event till it gets to about -60 again. And that's because as the cell hyperpolarizes, so the H, these channels begin to open. So as they open, sodium comes back in, and so about as soon as we hit that -60, these potassium channels, they close, allowing sodium to come in and trigger another action potential. And that's kind of how this works. These channels, as it hyperpolarizes, more open, allowing more sodium to override this, close them, and begin another one. So as far as the cardiomyocytes go, theirs is a little different. So we'll start this graph here again, like that. They sit at about -90 because they are very permeable to potassium, and so they'll sit clear down there close to the Nernst potential of potassium. And they do sit like this. They have a normal, and then they have their threshold here. So it comes out, and then we get up to threshold, and we get a massive spike followed by a quick reverse, a plateau, and it comes down, and it never really hyperpolarizes. It just goes right back to that -90. And here, I'll explain how that works. So, -90, we have potassium channels that are open. So just IK1 channels. They're just potassium channels that allow stuff in, they're leak channels. That's all that's open right there. So we'll just put K channels because that's all there. We have potassium setting that. Here we have our sodium channel. So INA. Massive influx of sodium is going to cause that action potential. And at the very top here, we have our IIOs. So there are a couple different channels. One's a potassium, one's a chloride channel. They just start letting potassium out, chloride in to begin this repolarization. But here we have a plateau. So at this point, we have a few different potassium channels that are open. We have our IKR, IKUR, and IKS that are all open. And here we might be saying, well, potassium is able to leave, so we should see this continue to repolarize very quickly. But right in here, we have a calcium channel that opens. We have ICAL, so long-lasting calcium channel. So that opens and it creates this plateau because the rate of calcium coming into the cell and potassium leaving is kind of just plateauing that repolarization. But eventually we'll have the IK1 channels open, and that allows more potassium to flow out, finishing the repolarization until they close, and we can sit here with our potassium leak channels just maintaining that resting membrane potential. So those are the different graphs and how the different action potentials go, and they both have their own different numbered phases. So this would be phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. Or I guess phase 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, because we need one for each channel. And then the other, for the autorhythmic cells, it has phases 0, 3, and 4. It doesn't really have 1 or 2 because it's just keeping pace. So the next thing we need to cover are ECGs and EKGs. So how those work is we place different leads around the heart. So we have our heart here. We have our atria, our ventricles, some valves, all the good stuff. So if we put a negative lead up here on this side of the heart and a positive lead down here in that corner of the heart, we have a current. We have a way to measure where things are going, the way charges are flowing. So when the heart depolarizes, we have our SA node up here, and we know that that's the pacemaker of the heart. That's what starts contraction, that's what starts the heartbeat. This is what keeps our heart going. And so the ECG, it really measures changes in electric fields and depolarization across the heart. But it does this by measuring the electrical current outside of the cells. What we mean by that is when a cell depolarizes, if we have a cell here, we have a bunch of negatives inside and a bunch of positives outside. As this depolarizes, these will switch. And we'll get negatives outside and positives inside. And if we do that, we have now a vector with a negative tail over here moving in that direction as we are depolarizing the cell and sending that action potential across. So the way EKGs work is these leads, they measure the direction and the magnitude of that vector. So we have our little EKG machine here. We'll just draw a little paper that it's printing out, and it's coming out at 0. So that's 0 millivolts, right? So the way the heart works is the SA node, it depolarizes, it sends that action potential out. So these cells become negative on the outside and positive on the inside. And it always starts here in the SA node and it travels through the atria towards the AV node here. So we have a negative vector, the negative tail, moving that direction. So the way EKGs work is if it's a negative lead and their vector is negative moving towards a positive, there will be an upward peak. So we have this peak here, and as this polarizes, there are points where this vector will change a little bit as it polarizes all the way through an event, and some of those vectors will be facing kind of in a different direction. So as we go, we measure the magnitude, and eventually that magnitude is going to be at its most, when the vector is heading the most in this direction, and other times it'll be less. So we always go up from that 0 line up here, because that vector, no matter what, it's always going to be pointing in that positive direction, even if it's the magnitude of that pointing isn't as high. So it'll always keep us above 0. So once these are completely depolarized, we get here to the AV node. And so this first wave, the depolarization of the atrium, it goes to the P wave. So that's the P wave right there. So when we get down here, we need to depolarize the ventricles to allow them to contract. So what happens is the ventricles, they begin to depolarize somewhere in this area here, and they depolarize out from there. Well, if you look at it, if it's getting negative here and positive here, and then negative up here and positive up here, and it's starting in this area, that vector is going to be that way with a negative tail, but it's heading more in a negative direction. So we're going to see after a little bit, because there's a little bit of a delay between these depolarizing, the atria depolarizing, the ventricles depolarizing, we're going to see a little drop. And eventually, we'll see more depolarization down here and down here, and that'll move that vector more in that direction. It'll just push it out. So we'll see a big jump up as more and more cells become depolarized, and they change the direction and magnitude of that vector to really point that way with a negative tail. So we get this really high one, and as more and more cells become depolarized, that'll come back down. And the last ones that really get depolarized are up here in this area. And as they're becoming negative on the outside and positive on the inside, again, we see a little bit of a vector going in that direction, the negative tail heading towards the negative, which will give us another little dip, and it'll come back up. So this is what we call the QRS complex. So we have the Q wave here, R wave here, S wave there. Okay, so this is the QRS complex. So we have Q wave, R wave, S wave. And the last thing that happens is the ventricles will depolarize. Well, they depolarize, if we're thinking about it, with a bunch of positives out here, negatives in here now, because they were, I guess, positives in here and negatives out there. As they depolarize, they're going to repolarize starting here. The epicardium always repolarizes before the endocardium does. So if we have a negative here, positive there, and they switch, we're going to get a vector going in that direction with a negative tail, with a positive tail, because they're switching, so it's going to become positive, this is going to become negative, a positive tail heading towards a negative tail. So that's going to give us an upward curve, and this one kind of looks like that as the ventricles repolarize, giving us our T wave, or the last wave here. So this would be our T wave. And so that's more or less what a EKG would look like. You have your P wave of the atrium depolarizing, Q wave as the ventricles begin to depolarize, R wave as they're really depolarizing, the S wave as they finish depolarizing over here, and the T wave as they repolarize across. And there's some different ways that we can tell if there's damage in the heart by this EKG. So the first thing we look at to see if somebody may be hypoxic, having a heart attack, something like that, is we look for some inverted waves. If we have generalized hypoxia of the heart, not enough oxygen, and we aren't getting proper repolarization, we will get some inverted waves. But so if we think about it, if we're not getting a proper depolarization and repolarization in the ventricles, which is where a lot of these inverted waves happen, we will have a good P wave. So we got a good P wave. We'll get a good QRS complex, but then our T waves are inverted because instead of these repolarizing correctly, they will repolarize the wrong way, or they don't have enough oxygen to repolarize properly, and we'll get an upside down T wave, which could just mean generalized failure in a certain part of the heart. But the two main ways that we see differences in the EKG that are showing of a heart attack are NSTEMI and STEMI. So we'll look at NSTEMI first. So NSTEMI means non-ST elevated myocardial infarction. So what does that mean? Well, if we have part of the ventricles here, let's go right here, this area right in here, that's damaged, right? But it's only a little portion. This right here is damaged and it won't repolarize. We're not getting any repolarization. It's just gonna depolarize once and it won't repolarize. We're gonna get a bunch of positive charges inside the cell and negative outside the cell. But if we look at it, the initial depolarization event, we have a negative tail going towards a positive lead. So what's that going to do? We will actually have a change in our baseline because we have this background current of energy. There's a current there from an injury that's just in the background at all times. So you'll have it come out at baseline and then it'll pop up and go like that. We have this background current that's always pointing with a negative to a positive. So what happens? We get a regular P wave, we get a QRS complex, but here's where it's different. The S wave, it must always come down to the original baseline. So in this case, this S wave will be exaggerated. It will come back up and it'll slowly make that T wave and go back to the new baseline. So this is NSTEMI, non-ST elevated myocardial infarction. This shows us that there is a portion of the ventricle wall that is damaged. It's hypoxic. It's not getting the oxygen necessary to repolarize. But if this is a full thickness injury, if we have a full thickness, everything here is hypoxic in that area, we have a bunch of positives here with negatives on the outside. And because of the way the heart is shaped, we're going to get an average vector heading up in that direction, which would be a negative tail heading towards a negative. So for STEMI, so that was end STEMI, we'll look at STEMI now. STEMI is ST elevated myocardial infarction. So what happens is we have a negative going towards a negative. So this initial thing is going to drop. It'll come out, we'll get a P wave, Q, R, and see here's the S. The S only comes down to there, and then the T wave comes down to normal. You see how that ST complex isn't elevated, it's just kind of flattened out? So we have STEMI. And that is important because if we have somebody who goes from STEMI to end STEMI, or end STEMI to STEMI, so we have STEMI here, this is bad because we have full thickness damage to the myocardium. It's really hypoxic. We might lose it if we don't get energy back to it. All right, so we have the next thing we want to talk about. We can erase these leads because we're done with ECGs. If we have some autonomic nervous system and things that affect the heart. So if we draw up that heart rate, again, the heart rate graph for action potentials, there's a couple different things that happen. So we have beta 1 receptors in the heart that will accept different adrenergic androgens, I guess. So like epinephrine, norepinephrine, those sort of things. So when we have a fight or flight response, right? We're trying to get the heart rate up, get things going. We want to get this to threshold faster. So what we're going to do is we want to make that line steeper. How do we do that? We need to allow more sodium into the autoarrhythmic cells. So what happens is we will bind to adrenergic receptors, and that will open more of these HCN channels. So remember these HCN channels? If we are able to bind to an adrenergic receptor, it will create a cascade through the G-coupled protein that will allow us to open more HCN channels, which allows more sodium in, which will allow the calcium channels to open faster, and more of them to open in some cases to allow this to happen better. But let's say we want less, a slower heart rate. We're trying to rest, we're trying to do all that. We want to flatten that slope out a little bit. These we can get from muscarinic receptors, so our M2 receptors. What happens with these is acetylcholine will come and they'll bind, and it opens what are called GIRK channels, G-I-R-K, GIRK channels. So these are potassium channels. Potassium will keep the cell more hyperpolarized and counteract the HCN channels for depolarization, allowing us to slow the heart rate and not allow it to beat as fast. And this is a chronotropic effect or timing effect. Okay? There's other ways that the the autonomic nervous system will affect the heart and how it functions. One is inotropic. Inotropic is more of the force contraction, like how much it contracts, how hard it contracts. And this has to do with calcium. So again, if we have an adrenergic, some sort of epinephrine, norepinephrine come in, it'll act on the G-coupled proteins and it'll begin a cascade. And it'll go down, it'll open up some channels, it'll able to phosphorylate some channels to open up calcium channels into the heart. Because the heart uses external and internal calcium to contract. So some of these channels will be phosphorylated and it'll increase the chance of them opening, which will allow more calcium into the cell to allow for a more forceful contraction, more myosin and actin contracting together. And as far as inotropic and the one I'm about to get into, the lusitropic effects, we really don't have any muscarinic receptors on the cells that do this kind of thing, so we don't really see an autonomic response for the parasympathetic responses here. So the lusitropic effects, this is how fast the muscle is able to relax. Again, this happens from those G-coupled proteins. They'll phosphorylate some other proteins and either allow the circuit pump to pump calcium out of the SR faster, or the cytoplasm faster. It'll allow it to pump into the SR, or it'll allow us to get rid of the open calcium channels out of the heart to get calcium to leave the heart, thus letting it relax faster. And if we want to increase heart rate, we want a harder contraction to get all the blood out, and we want it to relax faster so that we can beat again. And that's what these beta-1 receptors are doing. They're opening HCN channels to increase the heart rate, but they're also allowing the G proteins to activate CAMP, to activate adenylyl cyclase, to do these other things, to phosphorylate things, and allow the heart to beat harder, contract harder, and relax faster so that we can get a higher heart rate. And like I said, there's not a ton that the parasympathetic does with the inotropic and lusitropic, but it's because we don't need it to take longer to take the calcium. If we're trying to slow down heart rate, the SR will just pick up that calcium because it has longer to do it between contractions. Okay, so now we want to look at the role of calcium in contractions like I talked about. So if we have a heart muscle cell here, I'll just draw it as a square because it's easier. We have this. It's a terrible T-tubule, and over here we have the SR, and let me get this purple out, and we have calcium in here. Okay, so here's where the myocytes, the heart cells, are a little different than the regular muscle cells. So here we have our DHP. Just like in muscle cells, we have DHP here. And here on the SR, we have our RYR receptors. RYR. So here's what happens. The action potential comes down the cells. And like we said, this DHP, it is a voltage gated calcium channel. So calcium, I'll also draw that in purple like I had it here. Calcium will come into the cell. And here's where we differ a little bit. RYR, it binds calcium. Calcium is a ligand for it. And when enough calcium is there, it will open the ryanodine receptor. So calcium will come down here, and it will bind there and allow calcium that flow out of the SR and bind to troponin. And after that, the rest of the contraction is just like regular muscle cells. But some of this calcium will come down to troponin, and some of it will come down to the SR, to the ryanodine receptors, RYR, open those and allow more calcium out. So you see how there's a little bit of extracellular calcium and intracellular calcium that's used here. But we also have here the Circa pumps, and we also have a different channel here on the outside. It's a calcium channel. It's a calcium leak channel. It allows calcium out of the cell. So when calcium is high inside, they can either go up the Circa pump and it back in, or out through these leak channels. And that's kind of where the calcium is different in the heart cell versus muscle cells. And this is actually what's called NCX. We'll put that here, NCX. And it's actually a calcium pump. It'll bring sodium in and calcium out. So it's an ATPase. We need ATP to do it. And that's another reason why ATP and like the hypoxia is such a big deal in heart muscle cells. Alrighty. So the last thing that we need to go over is the cycle, the heart cycle. So we will have two axes here, and then we're going to have another graph directly below, which is one. This one is pressure, and it's in millimeters of mercury. And then here we just have time. Okay, so we're just going to kind of scale this up. Let me erase this here. We'll do one of these little fun guys. Okay, so down here, this is at about 80 millimeters of mercury. We'll do 120 up here. So what happens is we'll look at the atrial pressure first. Atrial pressure, it kind of comes out here, and it'll do a little bump, and it'll go down, and then it bumps up one more time a little bit, comes down. We'll see another bump, down, and it stays roughly right there. There's not a ton of pressure in the atria. It stays kind of right there. All right. The next one we'll look at is the ventricle pressure. The ventricles, it'll come right here below, right around 80. But here, we'll get a big jump, and it comes back down, and it joins here. Big jump, back down, there. This is where the ventricle is pumping. It's pushing all that blood out, which brings me to my next point. This bottom graph, we're going to have volume. So this is volume, and this is the ventricle volume. So the ventricle volume, it's going to be slowly filling, slowly filling, slowly filling, and then it'll kind of fill up right here, and it'll go way down. And it'll slowly fill, slowly fill, slowly fill, and we see it bumping right here and down. And you see how it's kind of matched with this? So right here, this is where the atria pumps, and it gets that last little bit of blood back down into the ventricle. And right here, where they cross, this is our first heart sound. This is the lub, or S1. Let's see if this other one will write better. So this is our S1, our sound 1, and this is the mitral valve closing. I'm just going to put MTV close for mitral valve closing. Mitral valve closing. And we need one other thing, because there are two heart sounds. That's one of them. But we need to look at another pressure. Another pressure right here, it comes out, and we'll just do a dotted line. And here it comes up underneath here, and then they cross over, and it comes back down a little bit, comes up, and then back down. This is your aortic pressure. And as we can see right in here, they cross. This is your semilunar, your atrial semilunar valve. So ASL closes, and this is S2. That's your second sound, that's the dub. So this is the cardiac cycle. We have the atria here, and this is atrial ejection. It pushes all that blood down into the ventricle. And then right after that, the ventricle, it begins to pump. And as we can see right here, let's see, this is supposed to be fly a little bit and then go down. We have no volumetric change here for a little bit. This is the isovolumic contraction. We're not adding volume to the ventricle, we're not taking away volume from the ventricle, because this is, the semilunar valve is actually still closed. So here, the aortic semilunar valve opens. When the pressure inside the ventricle gets above the pressure in the aorta, that valve will open, allowing the blood to flow out. See, we see that flow out. And then when those pressures switch and the pressure inside the aorta gets higher than the pressure in the ventricle, that valve will close. And that is that. And right here, this little dip, this is the, it's called the, I just had it. Diuretic notch. So pretty much what that is the pressure in the aorta as the blood is flowing through, it decreases a little bit. But then as that blood kind of splits out in all the different trees, the arterial trees, it kind of backflows a little bit after that valve closes. And as it backflows after that valve closes and diastole, we get an increase of pressure up against the aortic valve, and that's what this second notch is. The dichrotic notch is what the second one is that pressure coming back in diastole. So we have diastole, where the ventricle is filling up and the atria pumps that last little bit there, and then we have systole, where the ventricle is pumping that blood out, and we're getting